Being an 8-year-old boy tends to mean that you're full of energy and always looking for an excuse to expend it. It's also an age where one's creativity seems to be endless and their imagination even more so. Jack was an 8-year-old boy who fit that bill perfectly. Jack lived at a home with his parents, James and Carla, and the two would say that their son had an imagination so vivid that Jack could create a whole world in his head just to play in. In fact, there is one moment that James can't help but to think of every time he recalls the incident that we're about to speak about. He remembers that one day, while Jack was hanging out with a few friends of his in the living room having a play date, one of the kids began talking about monsters, and James got an idea to tell a kid-friendly scary story, one that included a monster in the closet, a classic bedtime story. Well, when James got to the part of the story with the monster in the closet, most of the kids got a little frightened. You have to remember they're still young. But Jack said something that James took as a joke. Jack said, "I'm good friends with the monster in my closet." And James remembered at that time that it gave him a good chuckle. He thought his son was just hardcore and had a great sense of humor. But as the days went on, Jack would continuously bring up the wall man, as he called him. He would always talk about playing in the room with the wall man. There was even one time that Carla saw him sneaking a sandwich into his room well past his bedtime, and when she asked him about it, all he said was, "It's not for me, it's for my friend." And again, this was just brushed off as Jack having a very playful imagination and becoming very close with an imaginary friend. It was something that James and Carla thought was perfectly normal for a young kid to do, so they saw no red flags. Now, that's something that both of them will openly admit they regret. They had wished they had paid a bit more attention to what was really going on in their house. It wasn't until after the family returned from a 2-week-long summer trip that they realized the situation might be more serious than they believed. They had just gotten in from an 11-hour flight, and all three of the family members were exhausted. Even Jack was tired, which was rare considering it wasn't even past 4 in the afternoon. So the plan was for the three of them to just return home, order a pizza to be delivered to the house, and then just relax. All of that changed, though, when they unlocked the door and it swung open. James and Carla's jaws dropped, as their house had been ransacked and trashed, and there was no sign of anyone inside. Right away, they could see dirty dishes everywhere, the refrigerator was left wide open, and almost every door in the house was open as well, including the closets. James and Carla began freaking out. They were concerned for their family's safety and had no idea what was going on. And that's when Jack said something that hit them like a ton of bricks. It was the wall man. Right away, the two parents came to the realization that this whole time their son might have been talking about an actual person. So for the first time, James would ask Jack, "Where is the wall man? Where does he come from?" Jack looked in the direction of his room and said, "I told you, he's my closet monster." James looked at Carla and signaled for her to take Jack outside. Meanwhile, he grabbed his phone and began calling 911. The entire time, his eyes bounced between two places. One was where his wife and son were, and the other was Jack's room. He wasn't sure if there was anyone in the house, but he wasn't about to let it go on any further. After explaining to the 911 operator that he believed that they might have an intruder in their home, they told him to sit tight and that they would send some units out to him. And when the police showed up, James and Carla explained to them the entire situation, going back the weeks that Jack had been talking about the wall man. The officers decided that the first place that they should check was Jack's room, and they were spot on. They asked Jack where in the room the wall man comes out of, and Jack let them know that he met him one day when he heard him moving around in his closet. Jack believed that the man had been magic and able to walk through walls, but it would turn out that in Jack's closet was a small removable panel on one of the side walls, and once removed it would reveal a small crawl space leading into the house. The police called into the space, telling anyone who might be in there to come out, but no one responded. That's when one of them made the brave decision to head on in and see what was going on. The officer would say that there were immediately signs that someone had been moving around in the walls. It looked like the insulation had been pushed to one side and pressed to make sort of a pathway between the walls that was just enough space to squeeze through. And then a small path leading through the insulation led upward and into the roof where the space widened a bit. As soon as the officer popped his head up into the ceiling between the walls, anyone outside of the closet would have been able to hear him yell. He yelled for someone to freeze and to show him their hands. It turns out a 44-year-old had been living in the ceiling of Jack's house for almost a year. And once the man saw how easy it was to convince Jack that he wasn't someone to be afraid of, he said that he had spent almost every night hanging out with Jack in his room. Upon hearing this, James and Carla began to freak out. They felt so bad for not believing what their son was saying. But ultimately, they were happy that nothing happened to him and that the man ended up being arrested. As for Jack, from that point on, he was certainly afraid of the monster in his closet.